Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back Carl Sweeney and Raquel Stetcher, who are the co-hosts of the new podcast, the Cine Historians Podcast. Carl, Raquel, welcome back. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think we're teaming up to rescue a movie from obscurity today, aren't we? So that's fun.
Yeah, no one knows this movie. This is I like to. I think I'm going to call this video the 10 millionth review of Citizen Kane. But I've always loved it. I love Welles, as you both know. So I thought it was certainly worth exploring. For people who haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it in a while, but I'm sure most cinephiles have seen it, I'll just read a brief synopsis. Following the death of publishing tycoon Charles Foster Kane, reporters scramble to uncover the meaning of his final utterance, Rosebud. This was directed by Orson Welles. It was written by Herman J. Mankiewicz and Orson Welles. It starred Orson Welles, Joseph Cotten, Dorothy Comingore, I hope I have that somewhat correctly, Agnes Moorehead, Ruth Warrick, Ray Collins, Everett Sloane, Paul Stewart. It's got a wonderful cast. So I know you both talked about this on your terrific podcast that you recently did on Kane, which I'll leave in the description box below, that I really enjoyed. But can you talk to me about your first viewing experience of seeing this and what you thought? Raquel, when was the first time you saw it?
So I first saw this actually at a film course in undergraduate. I went to Northeastern University. I was an English major, and I was taking electives, and I really love film, and I was really, really getting into film at the time. And this was like a film 101 course. And of course, one of the movies that they showed was Citizen Kane. And it's just one of those films that is like, when you get an introduction to film history, it's one of the first to be brought up. So with that and a lot of like other big classics, we studied and analyzed. One of the very first film books I ever read was on the making of Citizen Kane by, I think his name is Robert Carringer. And and we analyzed that movie. I did a presentation on one of the scenes, and I just had so much fun. There was so much information about that movie. And this is one of those movies where the experience is enriched when you have context and history, background, some knowledge of why this movie was so important, what's good about it, and its impact over time. So I think that ended up being like my best introduction to the movie. But before then, Orson Welles has always been like part of, the public discourse. He's such a colorful character. And so I knew of Orson Welles long before this. But this ended up being my very first introduction to Citizen Kane. And then shortly after, I watched The Magnificent Ambersons for the first time.
So did you like it immediately, or do you remember just how you generally felt about your first viewing?
I did. And I was one of the few in the class who did like it. But also, I was studying some really like intense classics at the time on the literary side. So there was a lot of stuff that people thought were maybe boring, but still interesting to study. So, and I ended up liking a lot of the novels I was reading anyway. So I guess I'm not scared by a big behemoth like Citizen Kane, and really, really appreciated getting to know it and it being kind of a challenge in that way. Right.
Good. Yeah. This is the perfect show to be on or to tackle if you're not afraid of it, of a film this gigantic. Carl, what about you? Do you remember your first viewing?
Yeah, vaguely. I think it was in the year 2002. I'd started to really get interested in films a little earlier than that, about the year 2000, I think, when I was 13, 14. And then by the time 2002 rolls around, so I'm starting to study film. That's the year I start taking a film studies class. It's also the year Sight and Sound magazine, which I'd become a reader of, did the latest iteration of its greatest movies of all time critics poll. And Kane came out on top once again. It had been there since 1962. top again in 72, 82, and 92. So, like Raquel says, it's a good movie to approach once you know a bit about it, know a bit about its reputation. So, the first viewing I had, I was at least somewhat aware of what a classic this was considered to be. I remember liking it on that first viewing. I've never sort of had a conversion on this. I didn't go from thinking it was boring to thinking it was really good. I always liked it. I always thought it was pretty remarkable. I like the fact that it's a classic movie that works as a fun, enjoyable movie, as well as having a lot to tear apart and analyze, and things that we can discuss in depth. So I was always very keen on it, and I watched it many times over the years. And of course, it was dethroned, wasn't it, in 2012 on that Sight and Sound list? But
Vertigo, it's funny because that book that you have behind you, Lunches with Orson, Raquel, he mentions that he hated Vertigo. So it's it's funny that that's the film that knocked off Citizen Kane.
He has a lot of interesting opinions in that book.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Raquel that it's an interesting film anyway, but I think it's a good movie to put a bit of effort into discovering what was unique about it, what was different about it in terms of a 1941 movie. So looking forward to talking about some of that with you guys today.
Me too. And my first viewing was interesting because I sort of found it very chilling and moody, and like it sort of gave, like, in a good way, creeped me out, because and a lot of those scenes, particularly with his second wife, once she gives up her opera career and they're in their, like, that big castle, and like everything is gigantic, big fireplace, and you can hear like the echoes of their voices, which I love. And at the time I found that quite chilling. I didn't take to it. I saw it when I was quite young, because when I was getting into films, I was at my godfather's house, and I was like maybe 16, 17, and he had some DVDs, and I saw it there and I borrowed it from him. And that's what I mostly remember from the first viewing. And I can't remember when I saw it again, but I certainly saw more of his films over the years. And then I watched it again last year because I was doing a video where me and this film editor were discussing, what if there is a difference between a work of art in film and just a good film? Like, what does it mean if something is considered art? And this is a film that came up in that I knew was going to come up. So I watched it first, and I thought, this is actually a great, a really great movie. And watched it again. I probably have already seen it a few times this year because I interviewed Joseph McBride, who is one of the leading scholars on Welles, and he worked with Welles and he knew Welles, and he's got a great book which I highly recommend. I think I mentioned it to both of you, called Whatever Happened to Orson Welles. And so I watched it again to talk for that. And again, every time I saw it, I was like, honestly, I think this, I know people over the years, it's overrated, or some people didn't think it should still be in the top 10 in every Sight and Sound poll, but I'm not sure. But I honestly do think it is a near perfect film in a lot of ways. And I've come to really, really love it. I almost on my Letterboxd, I want to put that in my top 4 of my favorites.
Oh, nice.
Because I've come to just change them every now and then, as opposed to keeping the same 4. Just, because for me, it's impossible to pick.
Change,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Thinking back to 2002, when I would have seen this for the first time, I suppose the main difference between that and later viewings would have been, at that time, I think I must have only been very tangentially aware of William Randolph Hearst. I probably just read Citizen Kane is taking aim at, William Randolph Hearst, and didn't really have a sense of what that meant, really.
Right.
And I suppose that's a question I could throw out to both of you, you two. Like, how much does that knowledge matter, anymore? Like, do we need to have a sense of that watching Citizen Kane today? Does it help, or perhaps not? Because actually, although that's obviously the model here, the template, there are so many later figures, I think we mentioned Rupert Murdoch before briefly, Raquel,
Right.
when we talked about this movie on the Movie Palace, but Trump would would come to mind as well. You sort of see that the reflections that Citizen Kane has about wealth and power, they aren't that tied down to just one man, are they?
Right.
I would say. I don't know what you guys think.
What do you think, Raquel?
I think if you understand how bold it was to make this movie and to have so much of it be biographical to William Randolph Hearst, who had so much power in the media, and I think that will really make you understand the importance of this movie at the time. So I think it just adds another layer of appreciation.
Yeah.
And also it kind of connects to what we're experiencing today, this distrust of the media. Like, is the media like you have with was it the news on the march?
Yeah.
Little
Yeah.
documentary at the beginning, and it's showing this kind of grandiose, very florid picture of this man who has like excessive wealth and power. And then you have like multiple storylines also going through, like, can you trust what people tell you? So I think that on its own is interesting, but once you add the information about how powerful William Randolph Hearst was at the time, I think it adds more. You're like, wow, it's kind of bold that he even approached this, because he could have had his career destroyed permanently.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd have to agree, because it's one thing to go after in a movie a powerful figure. Like now, like there's already been a recent film on Trump. There was like a mini series as well. When it's one thing to go after like a powerful person in a film, but I think like what you both said is that the difference with Hearst was that he was so powerful that he could squash, Hollywood in a lot of ways. And so, if you make a film on Trump, he can't squash Hollywood. I mean, maybe as a president, I don't think he tried to when he was the president.
No one has that level of power these days. Like
yeah,
the level
exactly.
of power and influence that William Randolph Hearst had at the time
is
unequal today. Even with somebody in the highest level of power in a country, you still have people who are pushing back against them, who are detractors or who are questioning them and criticizing them. And but with Hearst, he wielded so much power that is just unequal today.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it adds a lot of interest to Citizen Kane once you know that. But I think it would seem like a very sort of dated film, or a film of its time, if that's all it was an attack on Hearst. But I think what it does is it finds a way to turn that critique of him into like wider commentary on powerful men, wealthy men, and so on, in a way that works really well. What I can recommend to listeners is in the Laura Mulvey BFI Film Classics book, she pulls in some of the context of that moment in time, that Hearst had taken quite right-wing political positions in the 30s. He was hostile to the New Deal. He was hostile to the idea of America intervening in the war in Europe. And what she's saying there is that's the rationale for why somebody like Welles would want to critique or satirize Hearst at that moment in time in the early 40s. And she reads it in an interesting way that although it doesn't really talk about World War II in the movie so much, there's one or two references early on. I think Kane says there will be no war in Europe, doesn't he, in like a 1935 moment in the newsreel. But she reads like the idea of him isolated in Xanadu as like a commentary on isolationism broadly, which is interesting. I hadn't thought about it until I read that in her book.
Well, like I can't. Go ahead, Raquel.
It's also a commentary on gross consumerism, because you have all those like extravagant shots of all of the stuff, just the things like he's acquired in his travels, and
particularly
statues probably from ancient Greece, and like he has these animals as he's imported to his zoo, and that's still something that speaks to people today, is that gross consumerism.
Yeah.
When somebody gets to such a level of wealth and power that they kind of lose sense of reality, and just like it's almost like an empty void, and they're trying to fill it with stuff and with people, and it just doesn't end up working. And with audiences today who, we're struggling with our finances, just seeing this sort of gross consumerism is appalling, and it kind of it still speaks to us.
No, I completely agree. And I can't help but wonder if the equivalent today is if a filmmaker did a film on, let's say, like now after the SAG strike has ended, if they did something on like the head of Disney or something, or the head of Netflix, or all the people who caused so much of those troubles for writers, for actors, and that, because of how greedy they are. And I thought, that might be something that would be quite daring, that where people could get squashed.
Yeah,
I'm just guessing it's possible.
It would have to be like an independent movie financed by someone very private.
Yeah, exactly.
You have modern examples of very rich, powerful people buying the media or influencing the media, like the whole Peter Thiel. I actually forget his name. Going against Gawker, and then Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. So we still have that today.
Right.
These really these billionaires who want to control the media, want to have some influence on the media, and they use their money to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think in Robert's example of if somebody made a film today taking on Disney, I think what would probably happen is Disney would exercise its influence to stop that movie being widely shown. If you put this movie in all your cinemas, you're not going to be, you're not going to get all the Disney movies we're going to send to you afterwards.
Exactly.
So I think the comparison here maybe is that, the vendetta that Hearst then had against Citizen Kane certainly did seem to have an effect. Because he had his publications take against Welles and the film. Apparently, a delegation of Hollywood figures tried to convince RKO to burn the negative.
Yeah.
Newspapers owned by Hearst forbidden to mention RKO Productions after what had happened with Citizen Kane. Basically, a threat of blacklisting, affecting the promotion of Citizen Kane, and meaning that it got a more limited release, in RKO's own cinemas, but, it was hindered more widely. So it does seem like Hearst did serious damage to the film financially. Mm-hmm. But I suppose the fact that we're here in 2024, like we said, Citizen Kane nonetheless rode that out, developed a towering reputation, and survived the attacks, and had the last laugh, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think I watched a documentary recently. I have it here. I'm not sure if maybe this is also in, because I don't have the Criterion one, but the documentary is called The Battle Over Citizen Kane. Is that in the Criterion? I don't know if either of you saw it.
I have it. I have.
Okay.
I don't know if it has a list of extras in the book. I'll check. But there's quite a lot of little documentaries in this.
Yeah, I was thinking of getting it because I'm sure it has this. This is the 70th anniversary DVD that I found it not too long ago, and I had some problems with the documentary, which I'll touch on, but they go back and forth between Hearst and Welles, and you can see how much, as much as I know you both said this in your show, as much as Welles denied that it was about Hearst, and clearly a lot of it is the private zoo. Like he had a private zoo, just like you see in the film, and a lot of things. I mean, I know that some things aren't, and he's not lying about that. But a lot of it is. But at the time, I can see why he was bold enough and confident enough to go after Hearst and not be afraid to, because controversy creates publicity, it creates box office, and he experienced that with War of the Worlds. You see, like, he scared everybody to death thinking that was real, and he was only rewarded for it, even though it was so controversial. And they say, and I didn't know this, they say this in the documentary, that while it was happening, they were telling him to stop, because he's like, people think it's real and they're freaking out. And he's like, no, keep going. I want everyone to be scared. And he later denied in the press conference, which you can find on YouTube. He's like, I had no idea people were.
That was my first introduction. Orson Welles was learning about that broadcast, and just
right.
It was presented in my class as, public hysteria and the influence of media. And I think we all had to write a little paper on it. So that was, I mean, and the fact that Orson Welles started the Mercury Theater and his own radio show, and then made his very first movie all by the age of 25, 26 is kind of crazy to think about.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. And there's something so attractive about the young Wells in terms of that fearlessness, I think. I think Raquel was talking on the Movie Palace about this in terms of, you know, he comes in, he's breaking the rules, he's shaking things up, and it's like, go big or go home, you know, that kind of thing. But just to think about, the War of the Worlds broadcast, or I think they'd done, in the Mercury Theatre, I think they did an adaptation of, was it Macbeth with an all-black cast, I think.
He did that in Harlem,
Yeah, so I think that's so interesting about him as a young man, and then that sort of tenacity later on as well, when it became harder for him to get films financed, and he kept going. You know, I've always found that quite admirable about him as a filmmaker, you know.
It's funny, in interviews about making Citizen Kane, he said he had the confidence of ignorance.
Yes, I love that.
Ask him, he's like, ignorance. I was just dumb. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. And I had all the confidence to just tackle it. And then he had also this sort of maelstrom of different circumstances. And then he had the best people working with him.
Yeah.
He had like Gregg Toland, cinematographer, Herman with the and then was it I'm trying to think of who was it, Robert Weiss, who was the
editor,
editing. So he had the best of the best too.
Yeah, he did.
But I love that, the confidence of ignorance that he said that was really his like superpower in making Citizen Kane.
Yeah, but because he said this over and over again, how much he owed to Toland, because Toland said to him, I want to work with you. And he's like, why? I've never done anything. And he's like, well, that's exactly why, right? Because he wants to see what that process would, you know, someone coming in from a clean slate with no experience in film, what that would be like. And of course, as we saw in this film, one of the things that I love the most about it technically is the deep focus. And this was at a time when you couldn't even do that, you know, and everyone, you can't. He's like, well, I can, why not? Let's find a way, right? And again, it comes from that ignorance, and we'll touch on some of those technical things in a bit. But what, you know, I think the film, in not in a bad way, is even though it has the way it's told is very unique and unconventional and interesting. You know, I think psychologically, I think the story is actually fairly simple, and the man is fairly simple. But there are a few things that are open-ended that I think are pretty interesting. And one thing to me that I've always sort of wanted to ask you both about, that I've dwelled on, is that we see at the beginning that his family has become rich from this gold mine that was discovered, that they had. What is it, that they owned a piece of the land or something?
Yeah, the mother owns the land. That's where her boarding house is too, I believe. Yeah, exactly. And so now they give him a way to Thatcher, this banker, to invest and to grow the wealth, because I would imagine they didn't think they could do it, so they give it to him, and so now he's living. It's so fascinating to me that they would have given up their child for the sake of money, but I think there's something there to it, because it's funny because the father first is protesting, and then he's like, well, I guess he gives up fairly easily. He's like, I guess it's for the best. And then when they introduce Thatcher to Orson, to Charles, little Charles outside, and then he throws the sled at him and everything, and the father says, "Oh, that he needs a good thrashing." And then the mother says, "Well, I'm going to send him where you can't have him, though you can't see him," or some. That's not the exact line, but it's something like that. And you can't help but, again, that's all from the point of view of Thatcher, so we don't know what their relationship was like. But I can't help but wondering if she was doing that out of his best interest, not just financially, but that something is troubling at home, where she thinks he's abusive. Or Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
To me, it always came across that the father was abusive.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, he's going to where you can't get to him. And that she saw this opportunity of having this land that could be mined for gold, as a bargaining chip of like, how can she give her son a better life?
Right.
And she's like, okay, if I use my power, now that I have this really attractive asset, and convince this millionaire to take my son and give him a better life, which the assumption was because he's going from poverty to wealth that he'll have a better life. And then we know that it's not actually the key to happiness.
Right.
That this is a sacrifice that she's making. But she sees this opportunity to give her son a better life. And what I think is interesting, someone had pointed out that Agnes Moorehead, in the scene where she calls out to Kane, her voice cracks. Like she's trying to be very composed and serious. This is a business transaction.
Right.
But she knows she's about to lose her son, who she clearly loves, even though she has this very serious demeanor. So this is definitely like, we also have to think of the era too. A lot of parents might have done this, given up their child, knowing this is a better life for you. We're living in poverty. You're living with this man who's abusive. Let me, arrange this so you can go on and be happier.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I felt about it as well. Did you have a similar response, Carl? Or anything different there?
No, I took it the same way, but it was a protective move by the mother because of behavior from the father. And I would just say that I think Agnes Moorehead is really good in her
she's great,
short appearance in the movie. It's a really delicate, understated performance, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I agreed with Raquel's interpretation of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you said, Raquel. Like she had the best interest, and I think that she obviously loved him, but it's unfortunately when you put money into love, I mean that could be good in some ways to give people opportunities and stuff, but it's in another way it can destroy someone, because if you're not there and they don't see you, then they're ultimately abandoned. And I think that's ultimately a big part of the film, is that and Leland, that great scene that Leland he has with Leland after he loses his race for the governor, and Leland, being such a good friend, says to him, you only do this to get people to love you, and things like that. And everything he does is to get love in some way, shape, or form. But his way of getting love is always transactional. Well, if I win this election, if I become this rich, you even see with his second wife, she gets mad at him because all he does is buy her things, right? He doesn't know how to communicate at all, right? And of course, like the obvious comparison nowadays is I'll get in trouble for saying this, but because people sometimes hate when politics come up in shows, but it's kind of impossible not to with this movie. But Trump to me is very Kane-like, and if you read about his history, and there's so many similarities, and in terms of he very from what my impression of him, he very much thinks that you're measured by what you have, how much you've won. Everything is a battle. Everything is winning and losing. He must. It's interesting that his brother. This is Trump I'm talking about. That his brother died from alcoholism. So and he said I read in an interview with him years ago, and he actually said they were always hard on the brother for not wanting to do what the family did. And things like, so you can't, I don't know everything about his history. I'm not an expert on Trump, but you from my impression, there's a strong resemblance. So now I'll get about 20 comments saying, how dare you bring politics into this? I even got in trouble on my
power, like anyone in that level of wealth and power, their stories are somewhat similar.
Absolutely.
It's like an emotional brokenness and this desire for control and influence. So, I mean,
self-absorption. Now we use the word narcissist a lot, maybe too much. Then people maybe throw that around a little too much, but I think it's appropriate in this case. But at the same time, it's empathetic. I think you do. It's amazing that you do wind up feeling for him. At least I do with this guy. I don't know if either of you did.
I feel like the film does hold you at a bit of a distance from Kane, though, because I think the clearest example is the fact that you aren't encouraged to share his opinion of Susan Alexander's talents. He's kind of besotted with her. He wants to turn her into an opera star.
Yeah, it's about him.
Yeah, but I don't think, another way of doing this movie would be to really implicate you in Kane's perspective, and we would see her as brilliant. But I think we're always kind of separate from that. We know that she's not cut out for what he's trying to make her do, Right. So I think one of the criticisms about Citizen Kane, and I know you've been sharing some of the criticisms of this movie with us off air.
Yeah.
One of the things
we'll get to the detractors, but go ahead.
Yeah, which I think is fine. I think it's fair that some people don't like it. But I think one of the things I've heard is that some people find it quite uninvolving emotionally. But I think the film is, like I say, is setting up a bit of a distance between the viewer and Kane. I think it's interesting how, it's so brilliant in terms of the cinematography, lots of low angle shots where he's kind of looming, and it gives him that kind of larger than life quality.
Power,
yeah. But then there are times as well where he's shot in a way that he looks kind of pathetic, where the perspective, he walks over to the window is huge, he's just kind of engulfed in the frame, and just to very quickly go back to the Trump comparison, seeing as you brought it up, and I touched on this very quickly on the podcast I did, that Trump has talked about his admiration for Citizen Kane.
Which is ironic that he loves this movie, and it's about criticizing men like him.
Yeah. I think it was Errol Morris that interviewed Trump about Citizen Kane. And
I love Errol Morris.
I didn't know that. I've seen that. I didn't know Morris was the one interviewing him, though.
I believe it is, and it's on YouTube, and he talks about the movie for about 2 or 3 minutes, and he has 1 or 2 half decent points. I think he does talk about wealth can isolate you and all of that, and he kind of ruins it at the end because he's asked what advice would you give to Charles Foster Kane, and he says, get yourself a different woman, and he just kind of undercuts that. But sorry, lost my train of thought. Yeah, over to you guys.
No, Errol Morris has a way of getting information out of people, and he says, sometimes you just have to shut up and let people show you how crazy they are. So I think that's really interesting that it's a short piece on Trump talking about this movie, but then you have the very end where it kind of shifts over to something that is very indicative of him, in his history. And I have to say, maybe just to go back to the question about the empathetic part, the audience connection to Charles Foster Kane. Maybe it's because I'm an empath, but I've always felt very touched by his story because he's spent his whole life really trying to recapture that joy that he had in his childhood, in that sort of idyllic scene where he's in the snow playing with Rosebud the sled, and then his final word is Rosebud, and then everyone's trying to find out, or at least the journalist who carries the detective part of the story throughout the movie is trying to figure out what Rosebud is. And to me, it just is indicative of the fact that he had this joy, it was lost, and he spent his whole life trying to recapture it. And I remember in an interview that Orson Welles did, he talks about this scene that was supposed to be in the movie and it showed Agnes Moorehead's character years later, I think maybe either reconnecting with her son or talking about the experience, and maybe she would show regret or whatever. But Orson Welles said that was the heart of the movie, and it was taken out when it was edited.
I didn't even know that.
He was away. I think he was in South America on possibly, I think it was the Good Neighbor policy. They were sending filmmakers to shoot footage, and I think they had sent him while Robert Wise was editing, and that part was taken out. So maybe if that scene had been kept in, maybe the movie as a whole would have had not like what you said, Carl, about it kind of holding us at arm's length, which it totally does. It might have had more heart and more connection to the audience had that been in there.
Although maybe you'd lose something, because I do think the pain of the separation from his mother does hang over the movie. So if you see them later, in later years, maybe that would have been reduced a little bit. It's hard to say without seeing that film, that scene, and how it would have fit into the film, I think. Yeah, very interesting.
I'm surprised that they took anything out, because I know he had total control. So,
oh no, they took a lot out.
Really? Yeah. So maybe the contract, because my understanding was that the contract was that he had total control over everything, which is why he wanted to do it.
I think
so
he would
maybe
have liked to have that much control. Like, I think, because also that's one of the strengths of Orson Welles, is that he was this genius, this sort of like mad genius who had these visions, but he also had to be reined in. And this is something we've talked about, Carl and I talked about on his podcast, is the fact that this is very much like an independent movie made in Hollywood. It's kind of about that duality, because it is so bold and different from the movies that had been being made, but it's within the studio system. You got RKO, you got its funds, you got, its producers, you got Mankiewicz, screenplay. Like, you have all the benefits of a studio system, but then you have like this sort of independent filmmaker too in the midst of it. So yeah, it has that sort of duality, but maybe it would not have been a good picture had he had all the control, because maybe it would have been overly long, might have lost its direction, and maybe he did need a studio to sort of like rein him in a little bit.
Yeah, there's a great quote from Welles, isn't there, where it's something like a movie set is like the best train set a boy could have, or something like that. The idea that it's like a playground, And I love the idea that's attached to Citizen Kane, because I think it is kind of a testament to the freedom of him as a filmmaker. But I think also what Raquel's saying is right, that there were limits to that. The budget was relatively, it wasn't inordinate. He wasn't like, they weren't throwing money at him. He had to work within a budget. He had to get the subject matter approved by the studio. So I do think sometimes people maybe take the idea of Welles and the freedom he had here a little too far. At the same time, I think he did have considerable freedom. I think that's obviously fair to say, and made great use of it, obviously.
Well, yeah, I suppose what it is that he had more than probably anyone or most filmmakers did, and that was part of why people hated him so much, because they were, when he, first of all, he was like in his early 20s, he was really a kid when he started, and he had all his control, and who got that? Veterans, some of these veteran filmmakers didn't even get. So I think that's why a lot of people he was not well liked. I like, because he's such a rebellious guy that they didn't even like that he had a beard, and he was doing it for something else, and he didn't shave it off. He's like, oh, they don't like my beard, I'll just keep it. He sort of didn't mind. I don't know if he thrived on conflict, but he I suppose he didn't mind that. But it's interesting when you say, Carl, and I think it's true to an extent, that there was a distance from him, of course, because the whole story is from not his perspective, but other people's perspectives. And I think that's such an interesting way to tell this story, because when you think about it, it's sort of like a biopic, but done that way. And can either of you think of a really good biopic? Like, I can't think of like a film that was a biopic that's a great film. Like, usually they feel very condensed. They feel, very simple. And I think it's because, and I'm not saying, I'm not criticizing people for trying those movies, but I think it's because telling a whole person's life in a film is almost an impossible task. And I think in this film, they sort of take advantage of that with the Rosebud, and saying, the reporter basically giving up by saying, I don't think you can figure out a person. So it kind of is taking that literary perspective from, and Mankiewicz was a reporter, the co-writer, and he would have understood that. Research, talking to people. There's only so much, and we all love books here, and, film books and biographies, as I do. There's only so much a writer can find out, right? And it's funny when you go read a memoir from someone, they're only talking about their experience, also, and sometimes that doesn't even come across as well as like a really good biography on someone, because a lot of things maybe we don't even know about ourselves and other people can point out in better ways. So I think the film sort of takes advantage of the limits of reporting on someone, of sort of telling a biography. I don't know how either of you felt about that.
So I think it translates that cinematically very well at times with the imagery, like the moment in Xanadu towards the end of the movie where Kane is walking from the left of the screen to the right, and you see him reflected in the mirror, and you see all these different Kanes. You know, I think that idea that there isn't just one Charles Foster Kane is one of the most interesting aspects of the movie. Like you say, the kind of prismatic narrative structure where we meet all these different people who give us their version of Kane. I like the way that's set up. I think the investigation works well as like a structuring framework. I think it does have a very, like a jigsaw puzzle like quality to it. I think that the fact that you have that newsreel right at the outset, which tells you everything, you know, you get all the details, the key details of this man's life. I like the way that shifts the focus from, you're not waiting to see, how his relationship with his first wife pans out. You sort of know what's going to happen there. You're sort of thinking more then about what makes this man tick. And I like the way that all the pieces don't necessarily add up to a coherent whole. There are things that don't quite tally. So I think it's a very intelligent approach to it. I'm just kind of thinking about what you were saying about biopics there, because the film that popped into my head when you were saying that was the Todd Haynes film, I'm Not There. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
In that movie, it's about Bob Dylan, but it's the idea that, okay, you can't have just one Bob Dylan. So you're going to have Cate Blanchett playing effectively Bob Dylan, or you're going to have Richard Gere playing him, or you're going to have a young black actor playing him, So that obviously doesn't take it to that level of abstractedness, but I do like the way that it portrays Kane here as somebody who is ultimately unknowable.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense, Raquel, or what you think of the way it approaches this character's life.
Just in us talking, I thought of a couple of movies. One thing is, one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges, wrote a review of Citizen Kane, and he was talking about how it technically has two plots. It has the plot of, the story of Citizen Kane, but then he calls the other plot the metaphysical detective story, where we're trying to learn about a man, but we can't fully, no one can fully learn about somebody.
It's interesting, yeah.
Because in the movie, we know what Rosebud is, but no one else does.
Right. We know more than anyone.
That we don't know. And two movies that come to mind. Carl knows this, that I'm on an Agnes Varda kick at the moment, but I recently saw Vagabond, and that
Vagabond's a good one. Yeah,
very similar to Citizen Kane in the fact that it starts with a death, and we learn about the person, and we see them in their life, and also the perspectives of the people who last interacted with her. So we learn about her from other people, sort of like how we're doing that in Citizen Kane. And then another movie, Sofia Coppola's The Virgin Suicides, which also is about learning about these 5 sisters and their eventual suicides through the neighborhood boys' perspective.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that's interesting because, we can, that's why maybe biopics never fully work, because they, truth is stranger than fiction. We can't neatly fit a life story into a film format without taking some poetic licenses, but also we can never fully know a person.
Right. The other film that comes to mind, I don't know. I'm not sure if you would necessarily call it a biopic, because it doesn't go over his whole life. But Bob Fosse's Lenny, he does a similar thing. Oh, it's fantastic, and he does a similar thing. So I guess maybe there are great biopics, but I don't know. For me, that doesn't necessarily feel like a biopic, because it's only really from when he died young. Yeah,
but some biopics do that, don't they? Like Spielberg's film about Lincoln, where it just covers like a very limited period. I think that's a valid approach to,
like we talked about on your podcast, Carl. The fact that really just shows them at the end of their career.
So Robert, what are the kind of simplistic biopics you're sort of taking aim at, just for context? You're talking about like cradle to grave type stuff. Is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm kind of doing like a general sweep, like, what was the one that Spacey did, Beyond the Sea, about Bobby Darin? Like that, like, movies like that, or it just seems like it's very challenging to tell I feel like just don't bother, or do it like this, where you're sort of like, exploiting its limits and using it to your advantage. But in Lenny, it's a similar. I don't know if he got that from Kane, but and he did the same thing with his last movie. Oh God, the title's escaping me now. I'll have to put the title card up. I actually interviewed the director Alan Hyam, who did most of Fosse's film. But in Lenny, it's cutting to someone interviewing the people who knew Lenny, but it takes a much more like documentary approach. Whereas this doesn't, he doesn't take a doc. It's very stylized. It's so film noir like in German expressionism. The style. I don't know if either of you listened to the interviews he did with Bogdanovich, which you can find on YouTube. And Bogdanovich asked him that, and he's like, yeah, people say that my films look like Fritz Lang's and German expressionism. He goes, I don't know what they're talking about. That was never a conscious choice. It's almost hard to believe. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, because most of them are so very noir like. I mean, was that both of your impressions of style of the film?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting use of light and shadow. The fact that the journalist who's, researching the meaning behind Rosebud is almost always in sort of like a shadow, or we see him from the back. So there's like this sort of mysterious, sort of anonymous element to him. There's several scenes where shadow comes into play. My favorite scene is the scene in the boarding house where they're negotiating the adoption of Charles Foster Kane. But then later on, when you have the first wife confronting the mistress at the other boarding house, it's sort of structured the same way, where you have this man, the governor like candidate. There you have the wife and him in the front, and then you have the mistress in the middle, and then you have Charles Foster Kane in the back, and his face is in shadow, and then he comes into the light, and that's when he makes his sort of fatal decision that ruins his gubernatorial career before it even starts.
Yes.
That to me is very much like using how you use, shadow to sort of reveal characters or create a mood that you definitely see in film noir. So this and the Maltese Falcon came out that same year. So those are definitely like film noir precursors.
Yeah, it's funny because I had never really thought of it as film noir, but the more you think about it, the more you see elements that are
certainly
that are commensurate with film noir, don't you? Like Raquel's saying with some of the use of light and shadow. I think the fact that you have an investigative kind of story framework. Mm-hmm. I think also the fact that it plays with time in a very interesting way. And of course, when we think of noir, we think about flashbacks a lot of the time, don't we? And I think you have to be careful, I suppose, because it's tempting for people sometimes to look at Citizen Kane and think Citizen Kane invented all these things, and of course that's not true in the sense that
no.
There are lots of other movies that use flashbacks before this, and you just have to be a little bit careful, I think, when you start talking about how innovative the movie is. But I think it definitely helped to popularize flashback-based narratives going forward, and I just said, that goes on to be a big element of film noir. I think what's so good about it is the way that it plays with time, and it does it in a very interesting way, and it's often quite fun, like the transitions from Merry Christmas to and a Happy New Year, and you jump forward.
I love that.
Years. Yeah. Brilliant touch. Or the moment where you see the photograph of all the great newspaper men, and then you see them in real now that they've been poached. I love
that.
It's playing with time in such an interesting way, and yet it never confuses the viewer, really, I don't think. You always feel like you've got a good grasp of what's happening. Although it's chronologically reordering stuff, it never gets to the point where you're lost, I think, as a viewer. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that, really, but I think it's very effective, the way that it orders the story, and it's quite a neat approach, isn't it? It's very niftily done. It never loses the viewer, I don't think.
Well, no, I completely agree, because you have, I know we've talked about it, but we go from the newsreel and then them not being happy with it. So the reporter is trying to figure out what Rosebud is all about, his last word. And so we have, we get Thatcher's perspective, but his perspective is from the reporter reading his memoir. And so we only get those parts. And it's so interesting because you're right. It like that cut is so appropriate because it's not just, it doesn't feel like he's showing off like, hey, I'm just going to do this cut and people will be like in awe of this, of how clever this looked, because I also think it spoke to their relationship that there was nothing between them. It's like Merry Christmas, boom, years later, everything was just hello and goodbye.
Yeah, transactional.
And it makes sense that they didn't talk for so long afterwards. So we only see that other scene when he starts the newspaper, and then when he's and afterwards towards the end of his life when he sells him the paper when he's broke because of the stock market crash and everything. I just thought that's so interesting. And then just like you said, the way it plays in times and with time. And when you go into Bernstein's story, Bernstein, you didn't really know him everything that he says is the facts. So now we're getting like, this happened and then this happened, and we get that great dance. The song, when all the girls are dancing, which is almost plays like satire to me because it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
I remember when I was young thinking like that's almost corny, but now I'm like, yeah, but it's intentionally corny because it's so silly. And he has such a big ego that he would have these people write a song for him, and everyone's it's sort of broad, And I think the Leland one is one of the more interesting ones because he's the one who knew him the best. And Bernstein's like, yeah, you got to go talk to Leland. Leland knew him the best. And what's so fascinating to me, and one of the things that I think is open-ended in this, is you have to ask yourself, why does he stop talking to Leland? And after he loses the governor race, is it because he wanted to go work in Chicago and he saw that as a betrayal? Or is it because he sort of told them the truth of who he was? He basically tells them that he's full of it.
Or the alcoholism storyline, which ends up
right
along with Susan Kane's alcoholism. It
was
point, I think, with Hearst. Because Marion Davies had a problem with drinking. So that also could be just the alcoholism storyline could be one of the reasons why he... Well, that's interesting.
I never thought of that.
And Leland, like Bernstein's like sort of like the business story, whereas Leland is like the personal story.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I think there's a very interesting moment when you see Bernstein with Thompson and he says something about... I think Thompson says something about Rosebud, and Bernstein goes into this story about how 50 years ago he saw a girl getting off a boat, and not a month goes by where I don't think about that moment anymore.
Yes.
I've always really liked that moment because I think there's something truthful there, and it almost cues you into a way to look at the resolution to the Rosebud mystery, doesn't it? That something that's very incidental in the grand scheme of things can come to have a lot of symbolic meaning for somebody, can't it? So I don't know, just quickly, I was thinking about that when you brought up Bernstein. I think with Leland, I think that's a good example of how there is a bit of ambiguity around Kane and his psychology, and ultimately, like Raquel's saying, you can never fully know somebody anyway, and this character is always kind of elusive. Every time I watch it, I maybe sometimes provide a new explanation for why he writes that review, why he finishes Leland's review of the opera opening night. I think it's such a brilliant portrayal in that way.
Yes, and Leland has his opinion as to why, but again, that's just his take, right? He's like, well, you didn't know Charlie. He always had something to prove. He has to prove that he's honest. Everything is, and from what we see, I think what he's saying is rather accurate, but nothing is just necessarily, simple. Like if if someone asks both of you about me, you may both see something similar, but also something different. So what's true, right? In a way, nothing's necessarily true. Only facts are true. Like I was born this day and in this city, and that no one can deny. you know.
But then also that his actions later then contradict the fact that he finished off the review in quite a truthful way, because he does that, but then you see her touring the country, don't you? And it's like the St. Louis Inquirer, and you get the front page coverage and all of that. So it seems like he's directing his newspapers afterwards to give her a good write-up. And there's that theme of contradiction running up through the whole movie, isn't there? So that idea of sort of him being more on the left when he was a younger man and then moving when he's getting older, and even in the newsreel, the idea that he would support somebody, then denounce them, sometimes support and then denounce,
Right.
all the way through, this idea that this guy's actions just don't add up. He's one thing and then he's the other, and we can't get a grip on him.
Right, and then in the newsreel, you have like the people on the left saying he's a fascist, and the people on the right saying he's a communist, and that's like so typical. Now you see that all the time. It's like everything, like people just look at each other in such extreme ways, and I think some of those extreme ways are valid. But I think sometimes I think they're just clickbait kind of things. I think things are more complex. But yeah, I love, he's able to have some satirical moments in there as well. Rosebud, one thing I really appreciate about Rosebud, again, I know you both said this on the podcast you did, is that it is somewhat open-ended, because it's not as though he's constantly showing you that sled throughout the movie. Like you see the sled, and then there's a shot of the sled alone for, briefly, and it's snowing, but you're not. So when you see the shot at the end of the sled being burnt, it's not like right away, like, oh yes, now we know that it's because of this, now we know why. You still do have to think about it, because I think it's an obvious what it means, but he doesn't sort of just, he kind of feeds it to you, but he doesn't make it so easy. You're not constantly reminded. You still have to go and be like, yes, it's, the snow globe he's thinking about when he was the last time he was happy before he became his journey to become corrupted ultimately. And it's, it was a better time. Right. And things like that. Was that both of your experience, just of what the, the sled represents?
So this is interesting, because when I was rewatching the ending this morning, I had noticed that, in my mind, it always ends with the Rosebud sled in the furnace and the flames kind of flickering around and the paint sort of melting. But yeah, it does. When you first watch it, you're starting to make connections. Oh, like this is Rosebud. Oh, it goes back to that early scene with him playing with Rosebud in the snow, and we don't know it's Rosebud until the end. But then like the movie keeps going, because it has that shot of Xanadu with like the chimney and the billowing smoke coming out from them burning everything.
Yes.
And then it goes to the gate where it says no trespassing. And maybe that's giving the audience a little time to connect everything rather than ending it kind of abruptly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
With the Rosebud shot.
Yeah, that's true.
I think what's so interesting about Rosebud is, like, there's a way, there are ways to interpret it that are somewhat, obvious. It's a reminder of lost innocence and the separation from his mother and all of that. Mm-hmm. But then, and I suppose seeing the film for the first time, you might think, okay, well, that's the explanation then. That's what was driving him, etc. And then you think about it a bit longer and you think, okay, that makes sense up to a point, but then all these other things he did were still very contradictory. And then you think back, well, actually, just 2 minutes before we found out what Rosebud was, Thompson was saying how you can't sum up a man's life with just one word. And
right.
it kind of just sends you down that spiral of thinking, like, well, how much importance can we attach to Rosebud? Because I know that some people have criticized the film for, that the idea is that Rosebud is seen by some as a flaw because it oversimplifies things too much. But I don't know. I think it's a very ingenious structural device that it turns this film into a mystery story where a man is being investigated. And what's so brilliant about it is, like we've said, that ultimately you can't have all the answers to the questions that are being
I agree.
raised,
Yeah. I agree. Well, he said to Bogdanovich, he actually wasn't crazy about that. He felt, as he put it along the lines of, it was a little like, dollar or dime store psychoanalysis book, it was a little sort of, but he felt it worked. And it was actually an experience that Mankiewicz had from a bike. A bicycle that he had that was taken away. That was actually in the I don't know, Raquel or Carl, if you read the book that came out on the brothers. The brothers.
I have it. Yeah, I haven't read it yet though.
It's really good, and he was a very complicated guy, Herman. I interviewed the author actually, and that she goes into that into some of the things that were his idea. I would imagine it was. I don't know for sure if it was his idea. I think it was his idea. I don't think that was Welles's. I guess we don't necessarily know everything, like whose idea was what. We know that they sort of worked on it together. Or do either of you know? I don't even know if that's sort of, is that mapped out? Who came up with what? I don't think so.
Well, I seem to remember Welles being happy to concede that Mankiewicz came up with Rosebud, certainly. Of course, there's a long tangled history there, isn't there, with Citizen Kane about the Mankiewicz-Welles collaboration. What I think maybe some people would be surprised to learn is that Welles was always happy to concede, from what I could see, that Mankiewicz had a big role in the movie. I think then it gets tangled when other people have weighed in as well. But how about you, Raquel? What have you learned?
Well, can I just say, going back to Rosebud is the big spoiler that is like everyone talks about, either Rosebud is the sled or Soylent Green is people. Like, it's one of those big spoilers that, like, you can't watch the movie now for the first time and not know that. Right. But I do think it's interesting, the authorship question, which, Pauline Kael famously put into question of, was this all Herman Mankiewicz and no Orson Welles? I like to think of the fact that they both won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, and they both had credit. To me, it seems like it's a Herman Mankiewicz script with Orson Welles additions or edits, because so much of the movie just also seems very Orson Welles. Like, it not going to like auteur theory, like there's a lot of people involved in making Citizen Kane. It's not just his vision. Like those great shots we were talking about, Gregg Toland very much is a big part of that. But it does have a very Orson Welles stamp on it once you get to know him as like a filmmaker and a person. So to me, it just seems like we won't ever know who contributed what, because they're both gone, and also they could also lie to us about their contributions.
Which is a very Citizen Kane idea when you think about the story of the film as well. One thing I should add, when I'm saying like Welles was always happy to acknowledge Mankiewicz, I think the thing that I need to add there is that there is a lot of talk about Welles wanting at one point to claim sole credit on the film. And
that was in the movie that Fincher did, Mank. They show that,
And then the compromise move was the equal screenwriting credit, and like Raquel says, both men then go on to win the Academy Award for original screenplay. What's your sense, Robert, of like the debate around the authorship, and like, have you read Pauline Kael's Raising Cain and stuff like that?
I haven't read it. I know a decent amount about it. Again, from the Brothers Mankiewicz book. Forgive me, Susan is
a very battered copy.
Oh, that's the Pauline Kael. Susan Stern wrote the Brothers Mankiewicz. Very nice woman who was on my show. Discuss. So she has a chapter about it, and I think ultimately Kael, it was more about her. My impression, and I'm saying this on limited information, but my impression, and also talking to Joseph McBride about it. But my impression was she did that as a way to hit out at the people. At that time, the auteur theory was huge, right? And it made people think that the director did everything, And so which is not true, and that's not necessarily what it's about. But I think some people interpreted it that way, and so she was used this film, which is like, on top of the mountain of auteur theory. He's the co-writer, the director, the star, and so of course she took this and said, well, hey, no, he didn't even write it, and talked about in length about the contributions of others. And so, of course, like, it's, from what I heard, it's just, she didn't do as much she didn't talk to as many people as she probably should have about the making of it. And of course, Bogdanovich wrote something as a reaction to it, and I know Welles was furious, rightfully so, was furious. But it was more about her battle with Andrew Sarris, who was like, they were always in conflict with one another, and I think it was more about, let me get at Sarris, who's going on and on about auteur theory and things. Yeah. That's sort of my impression of it. Again, unlimited knowledge of about that whole story.
Yeah, I think that's similar to my sense of it, that it was very polemical. It was, she did have that stance about the auteur perspective, the auteur theory. I think she didn't like the fact that some people who really were adhering to the auteur theory might look at, like, let's say, the worst ever film by Howard Hawks or somebody, and try and elevate that to being a masterpiece because Howard Hawks directed it. That kind of idea that, because a genius director did it, it must be worth study, it must be worth acclaim. She didn't like that. She felt that people were trying to, really champion mediocre, repetitive films in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think that's a lot of that's going on with Raising Cain. I do think people should check it out. I think it's an interesting piece of writing. It's just had such a long afterlife, even leading up to things like Fincher's film Mank. Right. Like you mentioned, that sort of debate about Cain is never fully extinguished. I think that everything in the film is kind of filtered through what Welles thought ultimately. That he even if somebody else came up with something, he's at the end of the line, sort of deciding whether it stays in the film or not. So, you sort of have to consider the collaboration, but also give Welles appropriate credit, I think.
Yeah, and that really is what auteur theory is. It's just that, it's that everyone is serving the director's vision, and the director has a strong vision for the film. And so a lot of that, it's not, I think Kale just took, and this holds true today, and I'm guilty of it myself, of talking so much about the directors and perhaps not talking as much about the writers or the cinematographers and the editors. And
the producers sometimes the producers are the ones that find the story and
that's true.
And do so much of that legwork at the beginning, and then they find the director for it. And so,
or even genres like the musical, where you've got to think about the choreographers, and you have to factor in all sorts of things.
Berkeley is sometimes even thought, like, he directed some movies, but he had such an influence on choreography that, like, his name is connected to so many of those movies.
Absolutely. And speaking of producers, like the head of RKO, I know that Welles, owed a lot to George J. Schaefer, because, as you pointed out earlier, Carl, Hearst really wanted to bury this film, and all the studio heads tried to get together to buy it. This is well known, and burn it. And Welles really fought against that happening and convinced RKO not to do it, and Schaefer didn't do it, and of course it ruined him, unfortunately. This is where I sort of, the one thing is that people, like, even in this documentary I saw, is that a lot of people feel that it ruined Welles, even in this, the battle over Citizen Kane. Like, even Robert Wise, the editor, said, if you think about it, the story of Citizen Kane is similar to Welles, because he had this big, supposedly big downfall. But I don't see it that way. And I know that Joseph McBride, I highly recommend his book, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, because that's what people always said. And even in the documentary, they say that it's like, he played some bit parts after this, and he self-financed films, and that was it. And then he died. And I know he said certain things, Chris, sort of, it's 98% hustling. I should have done something else with my life, and this is no way to live. But I fell in love with movies, and it's like being loyal to a girl. You just can't leave her when you're when you really love her. But the fact is, he kept making movies, and he had passionate, creative relationships with many people afterwards. Like there's a memoir of his cameraman that his cameraman wrote from, who was his cameraman on the other side of the wind in the last 15 years of his life. And they were shooting stuff all the time, you know, whether it was the movies, it was commercials, it was the cooking shows.
Oh, his
Cooking
commercials.
show. Yeah. And he made a lot, and he was doing commercials from his radio days, you know, I mean, sponsorship was a big thing and he didn't mind doing it. He made a lot of money, you know, doing that stuff. So it's not as though he became obscure. I mean, I think a lot of his movies afterwards are fantastic. If, you know, and I think honestly, some of them are just as interesting, if not more interesting than Kane. I know you both touched on his later work. How do you feel generally about, do you love any of his films after this as much or more?
I really love like I like his later work. I don't know. It's interesting because he there's a lot of evolutions of Orson Welles, you know. So he's not like just one fixed figure over time. There's like different iterations of him, and I think of like the commercial Orson Welles as kind of a very quirky character. I watched F for Fake this morning, and he talks a lot to the camera, and that's very
brilliant,
much a late Orson Welles sort of thing. I out of his later work, like The Lady from Shanghai is okay. I think it's interesting, especially that the mirror scene towards the end, I think, is really captivating. But I think like Touch of Evil might be my favorite of his like
great film, yeah.
later works. Although I did actually really enjoy F for Fake, even if I didn't quite grasp it. But it's very like experimental and fun and meditative on different aspects of life and being fake and forgery and fooling people.
It's like a film essay. Yeah. It's almost like Godard or even Fellini did some later work is like that. It's like a film. It's like Welles doing a film essay, you know, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I think, Robert, you used the phrase, I think you said near perfect to describe Citizen Kane. And I think, in a way, I wonder how we would think of some of those later Welles films if Citizen Kane didn't exist. You know, there are so many filmmakers who will never get anywhere close to directing something as good as Touch of Evil, but because it's Orson Welles and he also made Citizen Kane, Touch of Evil almost becomes the also ran, you know, which is kind of, I don't know. I personally, from what I've seen, and there are a few I haven't seen, like I haven't seen F for Fake, but I really quite like Touch of Evil. I really enjoyed The Trial. I thought that was really good.
Love The Trial.
Yeah, the lady from Shanghai is fascinating. Do any of them have the kind of crystalline brilliance or, like you say, the near perfection of Citizen Kane? I'm not sure they do, because like with Touch of Evil, for example, I'm watching it and it's so brilliant. And I'm also thinking, well, is Charlton Heston the best Mexican police, you know, cop or whatever? I don't know. I think there are criticisms I would have with the later films in a way that I can't really find fault with Kane. You know, when I think about what's not so good about Kane, I'm almost clutching at straws. Like I think there's a jump cut with the bird squawking where the bird's eye is kind of missing.
Oh, yeah.
And accidental, apparently. But there's nothing else I'd really change. And I wonder if it's just like the most extreme case ever of like difficult second album syndrome, you know, where the first film that people saw from Welles was so brilliant that it colors perceptions forevermore afterwards, maybe. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I probably have more of an unpopular opinion because I think a lot of people probably feel this was the best thing he did. Or, I mean, I'm hesitant to say best, and I know in this case that word is used a lot because of all the polls and the lists. And I think lists are valuable in a lot of ways, but in some ways, a lot of it is like, well, how can we really compare what's better than something else if it's a very, very different film? But I mean, if, you know, just in terms of how interesting something is or how compelling it is, I do think some of his later work, I find, you know, just as interesting, if not more in some ways. Like, I think his Shakespeare films are incredible. Othello, Chimes at Midnight, Macbeth is also really, really good. Like his Othello is absolutely brilliant. And his last film, which Netflix just finished, The Other Side of the Wind, I would honestly put that right at Kane. I think it is literally as interesting and as compelling. In some ways, there are similarities because he's also using different ways of telling it throughout. Whereas in this film, we have like the newsreel, the different perspectives, things like that, the montages. In that film, he has the film within the film, because it's about a filmmaker who John Huston plays. He's trying to fit into the new Hollywood by making like an Antonioni Bergman film. So you got the film within the film, and then there's the whole thing is like a party thrown for the director who's screening parts of his new movie, and it's all taken from the various camera operators there, people with camera who are like paparazzi. So the film can be in black and white at a certain point. It can be then be in color. So in a way, there's like really no director. And like no one has ever done that. No one had ever done it then, particularly. And it's more psychologically complex as well. And he's more explicit with things that we saw in his later work, particularly Othello, of like homosexuality, like that. And that it's much more explicit, where, relationships between men and betrayal. I mean, I suppose in Citizen Kane, the betrayal lies in between Leland and Kane, but in the other films, they're richer, they're more complicated, much more ambiguous. So, I honestly think just like this, no one talked about Kane for years. I think just like a lot of his movies, people catch up to them later. And that film kind of came and went. And I remember in 2018 thinking, why is no one talking about Other Side of I mean, I know they were, but not nearly as much as I think it deserved. And I think down the road, people will be like, man, that was a masterpiece in my view. Did either of you see it?
I haven't seen it.
I haven't.
But I think also Citizen Kane itself is not as much in the public discourse as it maybe used to be.
Right, yeah.
I find that a lot of people don't talk about it. It's funny, like when you watch the Criterion Closet videos, when you see filmmakers or actors go into the closet and pick stuff out, almost no one picks out Citizen Kane. It could be that they already have it, or that it's just not something that they want. So there is also and also seeing it kind of go down the list on the Sight and Sound poll of the best of all time. I think it's kind of pulling away from like public appreciation a little bit.
I mean, it's still third on the Sight and Sound list, but you're right. 'Cause in the last two polls, it's dropped 2 places, hasn't it? And Vertigo had been catching up on it slowly over the course of a few polls, and then Jeanne Dielman like leapfrogs right over him, over both Kane and Vertigo. I think with The Other Side of the Wind, I wonder how much that is just about the way it was put out there on Netflix, wasn't it? And how
possibly,
for years and years it was talked about as this like great unseen thing, and then now we're in a culture where things move so fast because
it could be
things pop up on streaming and people talk about them for 2 days and then it's on to the next thing. That's kind of sad, but I would like to think that you're right, that like you say about people catching up, that it might take a bit of time and then it would get the appreciation you say it deserves. That would be nice to see.
Yeah, I think so. I'd be curious to hear what you both think of it, because I think it's a masterpiece. There's a couple of we touched on a couple of the detractors, the Kane detractors, but I wanted to read a couple. One from Ingmar Bergman. So what he said was, for me, Orson Welles is just a hoax. He says it's empty, it's not interesting, it's dead. Citizen Kane, which I have a copy of, is the critic's darling, always at the top of every poll taken. But I think it's a total bore. Above all, the performances are worthless. The amount of respect that movie has is absolutely unbelievable. What do you guys both think of what Bergman said?
He also called Godard affected and dull.
Yeah, he hated.
Alfred Hitchcock infantile. So he had some very strong opinions.
Yeah,
I think what's interesting too is the filmmakers on filmmaker response like that sort of response back in like, in the era of Cahiers du Cinema and like Francois Truffaut being a critic, early on before he became a filmmaker, but then later on, just like filmmakers talking about other filmmakers, it could be brutal. I feel like there's more mutual appreciation and support in the discourse now, and people are not as like maybe like they probably still feel like, oh, that director's movie was trash, but might not say it publicly. Whereas in this era, these filmmakers who are at the end of their careers, or maybe they're on their legacy tour, they're at the end of their life, and they're saying some really nasty things about each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what I would say is that Citizen Kane as a movie, like we talked about, it's an iconoclastic movie. It's taking aim at a rich, powerful man and trying to displace him from its pedestal. And I think we're all like applauding that. So I think we have to have a bit of latitude for the people who then come along later and are quite iconoclastic about Citizen Kane. It's okay for people to take a few pot shots. But the thing with Bergman that I thought was funny is, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not. One of you guys might know, but I always hear the story about how he supposedly watched The Creature from the Black Lagoon like repeatedly, maybe every year on his birthday or something. And I just find it kind of the idea of that kind of funny.
I didn't know that.
Hell no, I'm not watching Citizen Kane again. Let's stick on Creature from the Black Lagoon, Not that there's anything wrong with liking that movie. It's a perfectly good 50s monster movie. But
he liked a lot of schlock, which is interesting, which is not, and I got nothing against people finding, everyone has just really entertaining, kind of movies that they like. What I guess suppose maybe people call guilty pleasures, but he loved like Ocean's 12, like things that you would never think he'd like.
Never guess.
It's interesting. Yeah.
But I think when you look at what he says, like you read out, he's talking about the fact it has this status. It's a critical darling. It has all this level of respect. I think what it shows you is it's very difficult to see Citizen Kane without all of that accompanying stuff being part of the picture now. Whereas that wasn't necessarily the case in the 40s, was it? It was perfectly possible in 1941 to go and see Citizen Kane, to like it, but also to think that, it's not as good as How Green Was My Valley. That's the best picture of the year, So in a way, that's changed fundamentally, hasn't it? I think maybe if, like Raquel says, it's falling away from the discussion a little bit, and maybe if it continues dropping down the polls, there will be a time when people can look at it differently. But I think what Bergman says shows you that it's very hard to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, can I just bring up a quote? I had mentioned Jorge Luis Borges earlier.
Yes. Go ahead.
His review of it, he basically calls it inferior and superior. Like it's got this dual sense, and he says that it's a film whose historical value is undeniable, but which no one cares to see again, which is true of some people. They can appreciate as a masterpiece, but it's not maybe something they want to watch on repeat. And he also calls the movie gigantic, pedantic, tedious, but also a work of genius. So it's got this, it's both things. Like it can really be a hard movie to access from a modern audience, who maybe somebody who doesn't know film history or doesn't know much about the movie, going in only being told it's the greatest movie of all time. That's a lot. That's a really high bar to say. And I feel like it matches that bar, but I feel like also you kind of need some context and background to fully appreciate it, which is in itself a flaw of the movie. And but it's one of those films, like you can appreciate its genius, but also say it's maybe not my favorite cup of tea.
It's interesting because to me, it's actually, because I not long ago, I don't know why I brought it up when my parents were around, and my father's and my parents mainly they love classic Hollywood, but stuff that's perhaps more entertaining, as opposed to like a really challenging art film, let's say. And I was surprised that my father felt it was boring, because I actually thought, even to a non-film person, it's a pretty entertaining. I mean, I find it actually pretty entertaining.
There's humorous moments too.
Yeah,
it goes at a good clip. It's not like
pretty accessible
through a story, but it has a good pace. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, I thought so as well. And, I can understand why people are sick of talking about it, and why it's being bumped off the polls because I think, people are like, well, let's maybe make room for someone like Chantal Akerman, who's been neglected for so long, or at least, you know, in some circles and things like that. But at the time, you know, at the same time, I mean, these type of characters are everywhere in the world. I mean, greed has always been the number one one of the biggest problems in the world, and now more than ever, you know, like so many people like Kane are ruining the world, you know, literally with climate change as well, destroying the planet. The other one I wanted to read, and it's interesting, you know, this is from Ray Carney, who's a professor of film and American studies. He's like the leading scholar on John Cassavetes, who's, you know, my favorite filmmaker. He's written wonderful books, and there's a lot of things he points out about, you know, Hollywood in general that, you know, I think are valid and interesting, and his writings on Cassavetes I think are great. But, you know, sometimes I think he's using rhetoric and he's unfair. So what he says about Kane, he goes melodramatic mumbo jumbo, exuberant, gorgeous nonsense. Fun, of course. A profound work of art, hardly. It takes more than bombastic rhetoric, gaudy visuals, and scenery-chewing performances to make a masterpiece. Kane is an all-American triumph of style over substance. Welles is Kane in a sense he couldn't have intended, substituting razzle-dazzle for truth and hoping no one notices the sleight of hand. The movie is indistinguishable from the opera production within it, attempting to conceal the banality of its performances by wrapping them in 1,000 layers of acoustic and visual processing. Critics obviously enjoy being told what to think, or they'd never sit still for the hammy acting, cartoon characterizations, editorialize. I have a hard time with this word. Editorializing blockings and absurdly grandiose and annoyingly insistent metaphors. My personal nominee, along with Psycho in 2001, for one of the 10 most overrated films of all time. When will film studies grow up? Even Jedediah Leland, who was the opera reviewer in the film, knew better than to be taken in by Salambo's empty reverberations. Harsh.
I think he stabbed the movie to death. Like, he's just going for it over and over again.
He's I don't know if either of you have read much of his stuff, but he's sort of, my impression of, I mean, again, when sometimes he uses a film that even critics put on a pedestal as a way to like put up another one. So he may take one film that sort of reminds you somewhat of another one that maybe is neglected, and he'll destroy the other one to put the other one up. Like, for example, like Wanda by Barbara Loden, which people are now just talking about in the last maybe decade. There's similarities to it with Bonnie and Clyde, right? So it'll be like, you know, everyone talks about Bonnie and Clyde, so he'll destroy Bonnie and Clyde to put the other one up. You know, again, it's rhetoric. I mean, he certainly has his points about even what critics really think are like art films, and he'll say, no, that's not, and he'll say, like, for this, oh, it's all style and stuff. But, you know, I mean, he doesn't really explain why. He just sort of attacks, you know. So I don't know what you both think of what he said. Any opinions there?
Well, in terms of what he was saying there about like it being fun and exuberant, I think one of the things that really draws me to cinema as a medium is that, you know, mainstream cinema, certainly, it's something that can really connect with people who don't have or don't need a lot of background knowledge. You know, it makes film a very different medium to certain types of painting, for example, where you need a bit of a broader perspective to get what's going on. So the fact that Citizen Kane is fun and exuberant and it has scenery chewing performances, and I suppose he's right, because when you look at the actor playing Mr. Carter, for example, you know, the guy who's constantly like blowing out his cheeks, and you know, when Kane comes in to run the newspaper, it does it does have like performances that are a little bit exuberant or over the top.
A few. Yeah,
but I think some of those things that he's saying are actually a positive feature of the film rather than being a criticism against it.
Yeah, I agree.
When he says critics obviously enjoy being told what to think, that's the bit I have the hardest time with, because like we've been saying, there are aspects of the film that do remain enigmatic even like 80 odd years later. So I'm not sure about that. I don't know. In terms of what he's saying about truth, I just think the film is making a point about things like how unknowable people are, about how power and wealth like corrodes, is corrosive. And I think it's found brilliant ways to translate that into a popular, accessible movie.
Yeah.
So at the same time, when he says when will film studies grow up and all that sort of stuff, I do think asking questions about its place on the pedestal is fine. I don't think we should have to accept it's the greatest movie ever just because people in the past have said it is. But I still love the movie. I'm not going to deny that. So what do you make of what he said, Raquel? Yeah.
When somebody says this is the greatest movie of all time, we should have doubt just to say, because that will also strengthen its position. My reaction to this review is the word bombastic that he uses. I feel like this Orson Welles and his character could be bombastic, but they're not. There's something about this movie, even though he's a larger than life character, he's got this really big personality, but it doesn't come off bombastic. But it could have if it had been another filmmaker. And another thing too is that this movie elicited a very strong response out of this this professor, and I think it's a movie that does elicit strong responses, like, wow, this is amazing, or I don't get it, it was so boring, like in the full range of reactions. And one thing that's interesting in the Citizen Kane box set that Criterion released recently with the 4K, there is a little piece by Professor Raquel Gates, and she talks about how she teaches Citizen Kane in her film course. And one of the things she talks about is the fact that some of her students were laughing at the scene where Kane, his second wife, Susan Kane, has just left him, and he's in that bedroom, which is like the lowest ceiling in that house. Like everything else is grand, and that's a very tight room. It's almost like a child's room. It's got animal drawings everywhere. It's got a doll that you see almost in the foreground in one of the shots, and he's destroying it. He's like throwing things, and they're laughing through that scene. And she asked some of her students, and one said, "Oh, it was just funny," and another person said, "It made me uncomfortable." And that was just my reaction to laugh. And I thought, that's that even one scene can elicit a response. And I think the movie as a whole elicits so many different responses. And I think that's the strength of the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, sorry, there's a couple of words I forgot to mention. After cartoon characterizations, he says, tendentious photography. And then I forgot to, because I have a hard time. That's a Jesus. He's a scholar when you write tendentious. I don't even know what that means. Either of you know? I need a dictionary to sometimes read his stuff.
No, I'm not sure what it means in that context either. Like exactly what he's referring to. I'd have to ask him. I don't know.
I mean, there's some sort of silly shots, like the one of the trophy where Kane is coming back from vacation and like all the faces of all the staff are kind of like stuffed in the screen. That's sort of silly, in a way. And it's one of my favorite shots. Or when he goes to meet his bride in the carriage or the car, I forget. And then there's like the sign of the newspaper, and everyone's heads are kind of like sticking out and it fills the screen. I think those are kind of fun, lighter shots, and they're not necessarily great art. But then you have like the scene at the boarding house with the deep focus and all that meaning added to it. Yeah. And it's just, so I don't know, it's kind of a mix.
Yeah, because I think some of those kind of sillier shots, like the song, for example, and everyone, I think those are more satirical, and I think they're meant like be poking fun. I like even when they go on the picnic towards the end, and they're just like driving on the beach with all those cars. It's like, what kind of
that's so silly.
Again, he's
all of this to just have a picnic at the beach.
Yeah, exactly. But what I know, from what I know about Carney, and I've read a few, like he wants things to be very challenging and complex and hard, and that's why he gravitates towards Cassavetes. He loves Chantal Akerman, he loves Ozu, which I completely and I applaud those filmmakers. But I think and just on terms of style, like he'll say that a lot of movie styles are are aesthetically pleasing, and it kind of holds the audience at a distance, which is true to an extent. But on the flip side, you know, do you want everybody to just do things realistically? I mean, that would be sort of limiting filmmakers' ways of expressing things. And so, you know, obviously these shots are all specific, and they obviously say something that are criticized, like, you know, towards the end with the smoke, you know, and it's obviously in the music, like everything is very obvious, you know, but at the same time, just because they're obvious, to me, they're still brilliant. They're brilliantly done. And so what if the film has a strong, you know, point of view? And at the same time, I think he's a simple character. I mean, I don't think Trump is a complex person because he's so consumed with himself and money and victory. And I think some people are simpler than others. I mean, I don't think it calls for anything more complex than what it's saying. So does that mean it's not worthy to tell a story of?
Yeah.
I mean, what is not truthful about it? But I don't even know if he necessarily means this. It's more like, let me just tear what everyone loves, you know,
right,
as a way to put other things up.
Yeah. And in terms of what you're saying about him preferring something challenging, but I think the reason Citizen Kane made such sense for a long time as the greatest film ever made is because it kind of embodies certain ideas we have about movies, you know, that film is a mass medium. It entertains huge audiences. And at the same time, the idea, you know, going back to things like the auteur theory, the idea that it can also be an art form where artists can express themselves. And I think you get both sides of that really well in Kane. Like Raquel said, it's a film that's both of that Hollywood studio system and the constraints of that system. And it's also kind of not of that system because it's Welles coming in to direct this movie from a different background. So for that reason, I thought it made sense as kind of the consensus pick. It's also the reason I thought Vertigo was a decent choice to kind of topple it, you know, because Vertigo as well, it's an intelligent commercial thriller and it's also a personal statement in other ways. And, you know, I think, yeah, if it's not his vision of cinema, Carney, that's fine. But some of the things he might have problems with are some of the reasons I like it very much as
me too,
as a classic film.
Yeah, it's sort of that idea of high-low. Like low as in terms of it's accessible and can appeal to many people, but high in terms of quality. And it kind of achieves both. Like this is a very high quality movie, but there's something that's very accessible about it. Yeah, I completely agree. And you know, one thing that that he does make somewhat harder is to watch is the fact that, you know, a lot of those scenes don't even have any cuts, which is brilliant because it gives the audience choice of where to look. And every viewing, you may focus on something else. And I think the deep focus adds so much to it emotionally. You know, one of the hallmark ones is the beginning, starting on Kane as he's outside as a kid, and then the camera pulls back. And then the whole time with the parents and Thatcher talking, he's still so present in the background. And what we're hearing is them giving him away, but then we're still seeing this kid like having fun outside. And it's like, if we didn't see him, it would be a different reaction. And you can focus on whoever you want in that scene and again, it makes it emotionally rich. And those are the kind of things he likes, Carney. So I'm surprised, I'm surprised that he neglects that. But again, it's rhetoric. It's a way to prove a different point, you know? So, yeah, I mean, again, we can talk endlessly about the style, which people have also talked endlessly about. But I feel like everyone, like almost every major filmmaker has made some sort of commentary on Citizen Kane. Or I know Martin Scorsese has talked about it being a huge influence on him. Steven Spielberg owns Rosebud. You know, like there's still like there's so many different reactions, both positive and negative from a lot of people.
Yeah, I just, I know I believe in one of his books, I might be wrong, but, for example, like he doesn't like montage because he thinks, well, montage is like, it's not emotional because you're just summing things up. But in this case, for example, the marriage scene where the first marriage deteriorates, and he does that all very, very quickly. But it's brilliant, as we all know. It starts on the short table.
Yeah, the
every
breakfast
time.
table.
Yeah. And then by the end, they're like so far apart.
That's one of my favorite scenes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he may feel something like that. Yeah, I'm not speaking for him, but I know his feelings about montage. It's like, oh, it's condensed. But again, that's from the perspective of Leland, right? Because, you can imagine that Kane told Leland, oh yeah, well, we do, it feels like someone telling someone else how something went down, whereas the second marriage deteriorating, we see all of that because Susan was there naturally and telling the reporter all about it. So obviously that's a much more drawn out, and again, it's the guy's whole life. If he had brought you through every emotion in that way, it would be like a 10-hour movie.
Yeah, that's true.
There's no way. But I thought it was interesting to bring that up because so much has been written about it. Let's hear about what some of the negative things are. But we could talk about this film all day. Was there anything else both of you wanted to say before we wrapped up?
I wanted to point out, this is something also I pointed out on Carl's podcast, is the fact that Peter Bogdanovich made his own Citizen Kane and made A Cat's Meow, which is directly about William Randolph Hearst.
Yeah.
And it's about the producer Thomas Ince, like sort of mysterious death, and him and the Fatty Arbuckle case really is what started the whole self-governance thing in the film industry that led to the Hays Code.
Right.
That it's about like the mysterious death, and then also about Marion Davis' supposed affair with Charlie Chaplin. But the crux of it is really Hearst and Davies' relationship and that sort of dynamic. It's not like the best movie ever, but I find it quite enjoyable. And for anyone who likes film history or maybe likes Citizen Kane and wants to explore something more on the Hearst side, I think that's an interesting watch.
Yeah, I've been planning to see that. Yeah. Carl, what about you?
The only thing I would say then, I suppose, is, maybe 20 years from now, Citizen Kane won't be talked about quite as much. But I do think that as long as people continue to watch it, every generation or whenever, it will acquire new resonance. Like, I think if we'd have had this discussion back in 2009, we'd have been talking more about Rupert Murdoch than Trump. And we'd have been talking about things like how this resonates with the post financial crash outlook. There'll be a time where you can talk freely about Donald Trump on your podcast, Robert, and you won't get lots of nasty comments because he'll be...
It's kind of like Nixon now. Like, if you criticize Nixon, no one's going to be like... But 50 years ago, you would have got people being like, hey...
Yeah, there'll be a time where Donald Trump is off the political stage and we can, he's safely in the past, but somebody else will come along and will remind us of Charles Foster Kane. So I really do think this film will continue to enrapture us and change before our eyes, as the years go.
Yeah, I completely agree. Could you talk to us both about the new show you both started?
Absolutely. Well, we haven't started recording yet, but we're very excited to get going on that pretty soon. It's called the Cinehistorians Podcast. Raquel, do you want to tell people a little bit about the sort of approach we're taking with this?
Yes. So we're looking at film history on a very broad perspective from the very early days to modern days. So it's going to be very comprehensive. And we're also looking at movies from a global scale. So not just movies from classic Hollywood, but movies from Hollywood and from around the world. And each season will be on a different topic and theme. It'll either be like a filmmaker or a movement or a style. And the first season, we're talking about new waves. So the movements in different parts of the world in which there was either a radical or very interesting shift in filmmaking styles.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, so it's going to be a great opportunity to look at different kinds of movies than we've podcasted about before. Because like Raquel mentions, we won't just be looking at Hollywood. In recent years, I've kind of anointed Raquel as my French cinema mascot on the Movie Palace. And because we've done films like The 400 Blows and La Diabolique, and we're going to go even beyond France as we get into this podcast and all around the world.
That's a great idea. Yeah, it's a great idea.
So it's going to be a lot of fun. And on social media, @Cinehistorians is our handle. So I think we're mainly going to focus on things like Letterboxd and Twitter. But we have that handle pretty much everywhere, I think. Raquel, don't we?
Yes, and also cinehistorians.com will have the list of our links.
Great, fantastic. And what are both of your personal social media handles?
Yeah, so the main place for me is at CKJ Sweeney, and a lot of my British friends have abandoned Twitter, but I'm sticking it out for the time being. I'm still on there, sharing podcasts and things like that. And you can also find me at the same handle on things like Blue Sky as well.
I have a writing portfolio that is raquelstetcher.com. It's got all my social media links. It's got links to my 2 websites, Out of the Past and Kel Movies. And it also has links to my other writing work, including the articles and YouTube scripts that I've written for TCM.
Great, fantastic. And I will leave all the links, the social media links and the links to their new show in the description box down below. So I'm looking forward to your first episode. To you both, and thank you again for coming on, and I'm sure we'll do it again sometime soon.
Cheers, Robert. Thanks for the invite. It was great to talk to you about Citizen Kane.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner. To your top left, in just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching and thank you again. And I will see you in the next episode.